So good afternoon, colleagues, students, alumni, and welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Scott Blair, Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at DeSales. And again, welcome to our workshop, our discussion on Indigenous peoples this afternoon. And as we open today's discussion, I think it's important that we acknowledge our Indigenous peoples. And here in the Lehigh Valley, we are on the ancestral grounds of the Lenni Lenape. So as we engage in today's discussion, I think it's important that we first start with that acknowledgement. And as we engage in this discussion, I am honored to be joined in this conversation with Dr. Lemire Turan, who is currently an assistant professor of environmental studies at SUNY ESF in Syracuse, New York. Dr. Turan holds a PhD in energy and environmental policy from the University of Delaware. Dr. Turan's research focuses on environmental science, social justice and law, and ecological sustainability. And he engages students in mentorship and advocacy in promoting the value of diverse perspectives in the arena of environmental justice. And I'm so glad to have Dr. Turan in the discussion with us today. How are you, Lemire?
Okay, sir. Always good to share the floor with you. We've done it before in a classroom setting, and I let you know how much I respect your work. So I appreciate you and the folks at your university inviting me to do this today.
Thank you, Lemire. And yes, Lemire and I are former colleagues from our time at SUNY ESF, and feelings mutual, my friends. I'm glad we can have this conversation. And again, you're bringing scholarship and research to this work as an environmental studies scholar, and your focus on policy and advocacy in that space with students and policymakers and education. So I'm so glad that we can be together this afternoon. And due to the intersection of our experiences as professionals, especially Lemire, you are currently in Syracuse. I had spent some time in Syracuse, and we mentioned that because in Syracuse, the Indigenous peoples, the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, is Syracuse. So we share that in the same way we do here in the Lehigh Valley. And I think to start the conversation, let's talk a little bit about the importance of acknowledging our Indigenous peoples today on Indigenous Peoples Day. And if you wouldn't mind sharing not just the scholarship and research that you engage with when it comes to environmental justice, but also your time in Central New York. How about we start there?
Absolutely. So it is important. It's vital to recognize Native and Indigenous communities, not just on this continent, South America, but Indigenous communities across the world, particularly when talking about North America, the United States, though. You think about the inordinate amount of freight that Native peoples have carried in the maturation of this country. And you can't think of, you think of two groups, Black Americans and Native Americans, the inordinate freight, one through genocide, the other through a partial genocide, and what's called the Mafa to our Swahili communities. But it's just important to be steeped in the contributions and not just the pain, but it's important to be steeped in the contributions that these groups have made to society and continue to make. You mentioned the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Onondaga Nation in Central New York. Most people on this call may not know how vital they are in conversations related to democracy, precursor to American democracy by generations. So if we know our history and if we give deference to our history, we must celebrate the contributions of Native peoples, like I said, in this country and Indigenous communities worldwide.
There's so much to that, Lemire. And I know, again, when we reference the scholarship and the research, there are so many lessons that can be learned when engaging and providing agency for our underrepresented communities. But in this space right here, right now, we're talking about Indigenous peoples. There's so much when we can provide agency there, and the intersection of their experiences and your work in the sciences are very rich and profound. So I was just wondering if you could share with those on the Zoom today a little bit about that.
Right. So a lot of my work deals with urban sustainability planning, steeped in environmental justice. I do things related to climate change, but certainly there are profound overlaps between sustainability planning and thinking about regenerative processes that Native communities and Indigenous communities, not to say that all these communities are engaged in the same traditional ecological knowledge practices, but there are profound overlaps. You can't talk about sustainability or regeneration unless you're talking about doing so with a lens in concert with and acknowledging and honoring traditional ecological knowledge and current knowledge that's being produced amongst Native peoples. A lot of the work I do, Scott, is related to environmental and energy justice. And when you do environmental justice work, you're thinking about environmentalism specifically from a lens that honors the contributions and looks at the marginalization of marginalized communities. And you think about these things outside of, well, who lives next to a toxic waste facility or who lives next to a Superfund site. You're also thinking about who has access to environmental amenities.
Right.
So it's very important that when we're thinking about natives, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, where nations are positioned or where these communities live in urban settings, do they have access to environmental justice and what we can learn from these communities to make our overall societies worldwide more environmentally balanced and just.
And that balance is important, right? And before we even start with that, we have to first acknowledge that this is important, which is really in the spirit of today's day, right? That when we talk about honoring, especially the spirit of diversity, equity, inclusion, we're talking about honoring the contributions that all of our peoples make. Mm-hmm. So when we go through this, we need to first start with our first peoples, literally the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of our of these great lands. And as you mentioned, not just here in North America, which is where we live, but all of the Americas, right? Central America and South America. And the lessons learned are super profound. And I know you engage in a variety of different aspects of the work. And when we talk about the work, we talk about inclusion and social justice. And, you know, I know that work well for having spent some time together with you in Syracuse, but for those of us that are on the call, and again, to our alumni, to our students, to our faculty and staff who are on the call, again, welcome. But would you mind sharing a little bit about some of that work, Dr. Teran, when it comes to looking at policy and procedures with local governments, with communities throughout Central New York? And I know you spent some time down in Atlanta, I believe, as well. You know, a little bit about that work and lessons learned.
Right. So when I was living in South, I definitely had some professional interactions with the Cherokee community in Eastern Carolina, but more germane to my current research, been involved with a project called I-81. This is an interstate project, and it's going to have some very significant implications for our local Native communities. So part of the process is me interacting with this community. I was asked to go into the nation as part of an environmental law and policy effort to talk about what are going to be the environmental justice implications for the Onondaga Nation. So this is not just me spouting off, well, I've read this 15,000 page environmental impact statement. This is how you're going to be infected or impacted. It's a two-way street. Well, what do you think about this development? What are the ramifications of this project as you see it? I'm not, I don't work for the Department of Transportation. So my job is not to be a voice box. My job is to create understanding, to receive understanding so that we can make these projects. When we're going to the state or when we're going to the Federal Department of Transportation, we're talking about sustainability. We're talking about transportation from a lot wider panorama. And if you don't mind, I'll just give you an example.
Please.
Very first time I went to the nation and was talking about the development project that I just alluded to, I had one manuscript. I had one way of saying, well, these are the environmental justice dimensions of this project. These are the things that you may want to look at as your community is ascertaining the value of this project. So we're talking about increased traffic or lessened traffic. We're talking about possibly burial grounds being disturbed. And then a sister from the nation comes to me and says, well, I've been working on development projects or, fighting against development projects that encroach on native lands for quite some time. And anytime I've experienced a large scale development project, I'm always conscious of man camps. And with man camps comes the increased propensity of sexual violence, sexual assault, and rape amongst Indigenous women. So it really forced me to think about more holistically, what is environmental justice? And if we're not secure against those things, then we're not talking racial justice. If we're not secure against those things, we're not talking gender justice. If we're not secure against those things, then you're not talking environmental justice. So it really gave me a deep and profound understanding. And the best thing about my experience as a person that does research in these communities, I was invited back. And that's always important to me, Scott, Coach Blair, Vice President Blair. It's always important because in this game, the game of higher education, it's easy to be an extractivist. And what I mean is you go, you look at a marginalized community for some benefit. Maybe it's to get a grant, maybe it's to get tenure, maybe it's to get a journal article. And I'm not saying it's anything wrong with those things, but I never want my scholarship to be about that. So the fact that communities have embraced the work, they see value in the work, and they see a research agenda that goes beyond what is personal gain, but they see a research gain of how can we improve and integrate a community, how can we integrate sustainability thinking from those communities. That's what's valuable to me, notwithstanding all the other things.
Right. That's a really powerful point. And in some respects, that's a change of how we do business in some respects, right? And how have those conversations expanded, if you will? Because obviously, as you had just shared, the interactions that Indigenous peoples have had are different from that approach. So how has that affected your work and those in which you engage with in your scholarship?
Right. Well, look, let's not be naive. So for the young person that's getting a PhD on the call right now, I'm not going to tell you to do things my way. There can definitely be a price when you follow untraditional routes within the academy. And we'll save that for part 2 of this lecture 6 months down the line. So I don't want anybody to be naive and think, well, if you go about things a non-traditional way, there could be a price. That price doesn't bother me. I'll share with you the words of Bob Bullard, who's considered to be like the grandfather of environmental justice. And I've had the good fortune of hearing. If you don't know Bob Bullard, and I'm for sure there's some people on the call that do a web search for Bob Bullard a little bit later. He's written some seminal works, but I got a chance to hear Bob Bullard a couple of times, and he says it's clear as day, the role of the environmental justice scholar is not to get tenure. The role of the environmental justice scholar is to support environmental justice communities. And that's something I knew all my life, and that's work that I had known all the time I was in the academy. Never quite had the nomenclature. So that really infused me and propelled me to just think even deeper and just double down and further commit to doing the work in the community and on behalf of the community and in concert with the community. And so far it's worked out well because I have respect in these communities. And this is not to say I'm a one-man venture. I don't want to present that. I don't want to sound cavalier, but I just think when I'm working with my students, it's just so important. Don't be an extractivist. Do the good work, do good work. Yes, I want you to have a job, but if you're dedicated to solving and eradicating these problems, make sure you have trust within the community above all else.
And that's a great point. We need to definitely speak about the experiences of our students. And I know that that's something that you hold near and dear to your heart, but before, as do all of us here on the call. But before we get to that space, what was your motivation into the work? And I think that's important when we start thinking about advocacy and really just the passion that we have as educators. I think it's important to start of what were some of the influences, and you mentioned one already, but what were some of those influences that really propelled you at looking at not just the macro, but also the micro with respect to environmental justice in our communities?
Right, man, countless influences. So, family members putting books in my hand when I was 6, 7 years old, thinking about racial justice. And I was living outside of I was living in Metro DC. This is 30 years ago, and I was a part of a program at NIH called BRASS, and something continuing the legacy of Saturday Success. Don't ask me what that acronym stood for, but every Saturday morning, me and some other middle school students, we would go to NIH, National Institutes of Health, world-class facility. we didn't want to necessarily get up on a Saturday morning, 7 o'clock, but we got to train and study with scientists. I think I met the guy who created the vaccination for polio, Professor or Dr. Salk. It's been a long time ago, but just if you can imagine every Saturday morning, coupled with, like I said, being steeped in commentary on social and economic and racial justice, coupled with professors from the graduate level right on down to when I was an undergrad, teachers that love me, really challenging me to think about these things. How can we navigate society to be better? So I'd be lying if I said it was a singular thing. It's really an ensemble of all these things that really propelled me to ask questions in relation to environmental sustainability, in relation to environmental inequality.
There's so much to share with that experience, Lemire, and obviously it brings you to a place and time in which you are in Syracuse, and as we've explored in the last couple of moments, in your work with Indigenous peoples right now, the Indigenous peoples in Syracuse of the Haudenosaunee, what have they shared with you as opportunities that they're looking for as we start having this conversation about a partnership in revisioning what our communities look like?
Yeah, folks are looking for partnerships built on respect, mutual trust, that are not devoid of knowledge of past practices. So we can imagine any number of folks who come into these communities who have a legacy of exploitation. We can imagine our universities not always being open to students. So physically, yes, you can get admittance to a university or get a job at a university. That's much different than being welcomed into a university. So that's why I say that these relationships must be built on respect. So when that young Indigenous scholar, that professor comes to a university, are they going to be able to, A, do the work that they were hired to do or brought on to do, but psychologically, is this a place that is going to be comfortable for community members?
That's a great point, and I know it's one that you and I have talked about quite a bit in the past. Now we're starting to introduce terms such as diversity and inclusion, and as institutions of higher education, we have spent time looking at how diverse are our student populations and also our employee population, right? And when we say diverse, we mean ethnic diversity, we mean gender diversity, but do we spend enough time in the inclusion space, which is supporting that variance? And as you share this, what are some of those things that come to mind, especially as we engage with underrepresented students on our campus, and as you shared as well, Indigenous students on our predominantly white institutions, PWIs?
Right. So I would say that you have the manuscript, and I've worked with you professionally, and just for anybody that's on the call, this is not, I didn't pre-plan to say this, but having worked with Coach Blair, Vice President Blair, when I mention his name on this campus, he's been going from this campus for years. There are still students that see or hear his name and they'll instinctively smile because they know his dedication to diverse populations, to marginalized populations. But what does that template look like? Well, it's going to look different everywhere. I said you have the manuscript, but it depends on the local conditions of the campus. So one thing I would say is programming matters. Budgets matter. So whatever his budget is, make sure you quintuple it, right? I don't care if it's $5 million, but on a serious tip, having substantive programming, having mentorship matters, hiring matters, recruitment matters. So it's not enough just to say, well, we're going to admit people. Are we actively recruiting faculty, students, and staff? Because a lot of times staff gets missing from this conversation, right? And recognize mentorship is so important, not just for on the student level. Mentorship is important for the high brass level, it's important on the faculty level, administration, you can go across the board. So when people get to campus, are they going to have mentors, right? And then we haven't even talked about beating back things like microaggression, but just to go back to mentorship, because I think This is so important, you got to realize that so many universities are dying because they don't have long histories of hiring professors of color, whether it be Native professors, Black American professors, Latino professors, and on. And folks get to these universities And that professor, they're not just going to be a mentor for their students. They're going to be a mentor. They're going to be a professor. They're going to be an auntie. They're going to be a psychiatrist, particularly when you have marginalized populations on the student level whose needs aren't being addressed by the core canon of the campus's program. So just always be mindful of that. Like, yes, it's a victory when you make 1 or 2 hires, but you must recognize the psychological toll that the first Latina professor, or the first Indigenous professor, or even the third one is going to be under, because the mentoring ask, not just from students, but from other colleagues, like every time there is a diversity panel, oh, let's go get this person. Like that can be very marginalizing and even humiliating. So, recognize this and do better.
And you're talking about an authenticity in the work and a genuineness in the work, which is super important. And I appreciate the kudos you mentioned as well. I do want to add one for the audience as well, and also encourage questions. The chat feature is live, so Dr. Teran and I can respond accordingly to any of your questions or inquiries. Please do. But the mentorship one is one that I know it is near and dear to our hearts, and you have been well recognized for your work in that space as an educator in Syracuse. So let's live in that space for a moment. What have the experiences, how do you immerse students in this work? And when I say this work, your work as an environmental justice scholar, and in advancing their passions, being able to embed that mentorship piece to ensure success?
Right. So number one, you have to get out of the classroom and you have to be in communities, right? So I can give you brilliant case studies all day and you're going to write an excellent thesis or dissertation, but you have to get out into the field. So just fast forward, or rewind. I met some of my students in person for the first time today because we had an environmental justice field trip where we went to a local community and we were looking at this assortment of locally unwanted land uses in a neighborhood that's very adjacent to campus, right? So it's one thing for me to show them a video. It's one thing to let them read a paper about this, but you don't understand the visceral reaction until you can see that steam plant that's directly across the street from an elevated highway that's literally on top of a basketball court. And we're talking about Wilson Park in Syracuse. You know where I'm talking about, Coach or Vice President Blair, because you've been there and you've probably walked or ridden by it millions of times. So you have to get people in communities willing to engage.
How do you provide the space for those experiences to be learned, listened to, and learned, especially from that perspective of the student who you're preparing to be in that space of moving that research and scholarship forward to advance that need to be heard, especially when we're talking about environmental justice?
Right. Well, you create the space by being very mindful. Like these are things that are built into the syllabus. It's not like off the cuff, like, hey, I want you to go to 2 or 3 community meetings, you pick. But, in the same way I build my reading list at the beginning of a semester or during the summer before semester starts, winter break, I consciously build in a community activity like that. So students know, and of course it's not mandatory, particularly during the time of the pandemic. So we made sure we were socially distanced and everybody had their PPE. And, I had probably 2 gallons of hand sanitizer to make sure that we were all secure. But you have to mindfully and consciously build this stuff into your syllabus the same way that you build time in a chemistry lab, same way you build time in the GIS lab, same way you build time reading good books.
Well, now I love it. And inclusion in teaching is really important. So for our students to be, when they're in the classroom, to be their authentic, genuine selves, and to be able to engage in the material with the identity that they know and the identities they also want to be able to support. How do you do that in the environmental scholarship that you're a part of? Because you're engaged with students from so many different backgrounds, whether it's a student from the 5 boroughs of New York City, whether it's a student from upstate New York, they have different environments in which they are looking to take the scholarship and connect it, right? To take that scholarship and put it into practice. How do you engage in that variance in which you're able to provide that equity-minded approach to instruction?
Right. Well, I just want to approach the education My classroom is almost like many years ago, I used to teach at a law school. So I guess you could say I was a law professor, but my classroom in many ways simulates that type of environment where you do have just stringent academic disagreements, people who are vehemently passionate about issues, and you see these figurative shootouts in class, and we love that type of atmosphere. I can remember being an undergrad in the 1990s at UGA arguing with my professors respectfully, but at no point in time are we going to allow racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera. Those things are going to get beat back immediately. So you encourage and you embrace those intellectual differences, but when you see things going in an unhealthy direction, you have to be very adamant about protecting, because sometimes students aren't comfortable jousting. And I recognize that and I respect that. So you have to make sure to respect and protect students that aren't necessarily comfortable vocally saying, hey, wait a minute, somebody just went too far. And as long as you can have that level of trust in your classroom, I think it's a healthy space that benefits the students, but I know it definitely benefits me.
That's a great point, and I think it's a great segue to where we are right now as a country. Is we have unrest in a variety of different places and spaces. How has that affected? We've talked about this in advance of this conversation, right? That is two professionals of color in this space being able to navigate that personally and also navigate that professionally, especially because so much of your work is rooted in those inequities.
Yeah, so the civil unrest you're seeing is a consequence, whether it be police brutality, environmental racism, we can go down the list, the litany of offenses. These are not things that are new to me. Certainly they're not new to you, Scott. So I'd actually say I'm hopeful more so than I've ever been. And why am I hopeful? Because just this summer, I saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people take to the streets, and folks who were demanding justice. And it's not to say that 10, 15 years ago, people weren't demanding justice, but I think that those demands, they smell, they look, they taste a little bit different now. And, we can go one of a couple ways with this. And, I'm not naive, and, I don't think that justice is going to occur. Just, people that have perpetuated marginalization for generations and, the racism, homophobia, et cetera. I don't think these things are going to go away overnight or even by next year. But I see a level of activity on the streets and in the classrooms and all over that I haven't seen consistently in this country, that we haven't seen in this country for decades. So that leaves me somewhat cautiously optimistic.
I think for many of us, and I think that's a great point, that the events that we've seen over the last couple of months, I think many scholars have spoken to that. It's a movement that has not been seen since the 60s. So we're literally living history as we speak. How are you providing opportunities for students in some respects to have a teachable moment? Because again, we are living history right now, and allowing them to kind of navigate that, and also maybe even connect it to their work in the classroom too.
Yeah, so I'll tell you about an opportunity that I provided the students, the most important students, my children, most important to me.
Yes.
So when the COVID-19 shutdown happened and schools closed, for those of you who don't know, Harriet Tubman's final resting place is in central New York, community named Auburn, New York, which is probably a 20-minute drive outside of Syracuse. So one Friday afternoon, I loaded up my family, and we took that 20-minute drive. This was the day's social studies or history lesson. We went to the burial grounds of General Tubman, Miss Harriet Tubman. That was the teachable moment. So it's one thing to talk about Harriet Tubman, and they've seen the videos, but to me, that's the most sacred ground in America. When I think about the greatest Americans, I can't think of anybody. She's probably at the top of my list in terms of the great people whose feet have stepped foot on this continent. So that's a teachable moment right there. And there are opportunities. I know where you all are positioned at in Pennsylvania. tons of history there, whether you're talking about interactions with the Lenape, whether you're talking about other people who defended democracy and championed and advocated for democracy. Always be open to those type of experiences. Once again, we can read about this stuff all day long, but sometimes we literally need to go to the sites to gain that deep and solemn appreciation for those people who've put us in positions to have conversations like this today.
And that's a great example as well of the influence for our conversation today, which is a discussion about Indigenous peoples. And Lemire, Dr. Teran, when we were together in Syracuse, I think there's a constant reminder. You mentioned Harriet Tubman, but again, of the Indigenous peoples. It's very unique. It's one of the few places really on the East Coast in which the Indigenous peoples of Central New York, they still have a space in Central New York. They have numerous spaces really in Central New York. They should have more, and that's part of this conversation. So we're going to kind of loop back to that, right? And especially as I think anyone right now, you can take a glance at in articles, whether it's the New York Times, and even in sports, that's the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Even in the sports world in July with the Washington football team, this space that we're in right now when it comes to advocating for our Indigenous peoples is at a place in which it's never been before. So again, what does that look like in the classroom? And especially as you continue to engage with the communities, with the Haudenosaunee in Syracuse, because as you talk about as you talk about Harriet Tubman, as we talk about the DEI space in this country right now, and where it's been, the Indigenous peoples are a large part of that. I know in Syracuse this weekend, I believe, did the mayor announce that they were going to remove the Columbus statue from the city. So those conversations continue to roll out. So maybe give some space to that for discussion.
Yeah, so let's circle back to a comment that you made earlier. So during the opening, you gave time to acknowledge the ancestral lands in which your university and a lot of universities on the East Coast are positioned in relation to the historic territory of the local Native community. And that type of thing is in vogue. Like, I'm for sure you see it on a lot of emails within academia, East Coast, West Coast, middle of the country. Like, I like to acknowledge that the land of this university is on, say, stolen ancestral lands of community X, Y, or Z. And that's a start. It's great. It sounds good. I challenge all universities, let's go 5 steps further. Let's go 1,000 steps further and say, okay, let's start with that. And maybe we'll put the flag up of the local Native community.
Right.
I challenge any university, this one included, are we making sure that these folks are welcome on campus, and not just welcome, you can come in and give a talk and talk about your customs and history and your science, but are folks welcomed on campus as young scholars? And are you doing things in concert with these communities to produce knowledge? Because that's ultimately the goal of universities, right? To ask questions and to produce knowledge. Can folks get jobs at these universities? So yes, let's start and preface. We need to acknowledge the history. Now let's manifest this and actualize this to make sure that our campuses are doing the work that honors the legacy of those partitioned and taken lands.
That's a great point. And especially when we start talking about access to our institutions, let's use that as a broad term, whether it's an institution of higher education, whether it's a local company or a business, providing those opportunities for access also acknowledges that members of Indigenous communities are a part of our community. And I think that part of the struggle is that we've lost sight of that. And you've shared that when it comes to your work as well. And that's part of that struggle. And you have to sometimes interrupt that bias, if you will, in acknowledging that wait, there's a space here for our communities to be a part of this conversation, if not lead the conversations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to go back, you mentioned the removal of a statue has a very racist legacy. Like, we shouldn't be fighting for things like that in the 21st century. And if you've been to Central New York, you've seen the statue of Columbus standing on top of 4 disembodied heads. I don't want anybody to think we're talking about gory heads, but whether or not you have a local Native community or population, like that image, it's
Right.
psychologically damaging for Native students, psychologically damaging for Black students, it's psychologically damaging for white students. So we shouldn't be fighting these battles in the 21st century. We are, and you see movement all around the nation, but I'm glad that you brought that up. And I just want to reiterate, you know, that legacy, it's not just a moment in history where you talk about some of the European explorers that have come to the America. It can be damaging for young children and adults as well to see that type of edifice or monument in the 21st century or the 20th century or the 19th century.
And that's a great point. And it's all about reframing and having a greater understanding of the importance of the messages that we're distributing to our students, especially our students. And I think for both of us, that's where much of our work is focused on, but also engaging with our colleagues to ensure that, again, we have that engagement of diverse perspectives in the classroom, out of the classroom. And when we talk about the experiences of Indigenous peoples with this particular example, when we do that and when we start to deconstruct some of those representations, again, that pathway for agency really starts to open up, right? And we start to see the contributions that our underrepresented communities have to the world that we're a part of. Now, you alluded a few moments ago about the rich history that the Haudenosaunee have to the American, to the U.S. experience. For those that are not familiar with that are here on the Zoom with us today, do you mind sharing a little bit about that, some of the contributions of the Haudenosaunee, especially when it comes to government? And I know that's a space you know well as someone who engages in policy work.
Yeah, well, I want to be careful because it's definitely not my story to tell.
Exactly. And that's part of this as well.
Yeah, so it's not my story to tell, but I would say, so I'll be very careful. But if you look at the democratic practices that the Haudenosaunee and the Onondaga Nation and other members of that nation, that community, these are democratic practices in terms of processes of government that extend well before the inception of the United States. So I'm always very careful, and I never want to leave the impression that I'm speaking for any community except my own community and my own household. But I need to go back to something you said just before you asked that question. You know, you were talking about the plight of those on campus who are advocating for diverse perspectives. And we got to be so mindful the anxiety and stress level it can be for those who aren't comfortable to be advocates for human decency in the 21st century. So when you get hired on any campus, you're primarily there to do a job, right? So whether your job is construction, whether your job is teaching students, whether your job is DEI, well, you're not off the hook because this literally is your job, but everybody else, you're hired to do your job. And then we're asking folks, you know, we're asking the female professor to advocate for women's issues and to speak out against sexism. You're asking the Native professor to do the same. And so we always got to be mindful of like just the 1,000-pound weight that are on folks' shoulders when you're asking them to do more than just their job. So I don't use words like fairness because they're useless, but be mindful of that. And if we don't change, if we don't reposition, you're going to see a lot of people who get burnt out very quickly, and they'll be looking for exit doors like yesterday. So some people call it the silent labor of the Black faculty member, the Native faculty member, staff member, whoever. Always be conscious of that silent labor when you're asking somebody or you're expecting somebody when you're at a meeting to speak out for equity and racial justice, etc. Some folk don't mind it, but it's not in everybody's disposition.
That's a great point that I want to get back to, while also acknowledging the point we made a few moments ago, which is, again, to not speak for when and to provide opportunities for underrepresented communities to speak on their own behalf, which is really important. And that's a comment that you and I had made with one another in preparation for this. So I'm glad we circled back to that. And that's part of the challenge, right? And you've shared this a few moments ago, that as we engage in this work to, again, let's truly be inclusive. Let's provide opportunities for all members of our community to have a voice in the experience, and so that we're not speaking for someone. Give them the space to speak to their own experience. And as we do that, as a person of color, as professionals of color, we are in those spaces. Let's talk a little bit about that fine line of speaking for ourselves as professionals, while also not, and this comes up a lot when we engage in this work, of avoiding that term of tokenism, if you will.
Right.
And I think that's an important space. So thoughts on that?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, when I think about my professional trajectory, your professional trajectory, no matter how good the work is, I got to be able to sleep at night, right? And if that means that we're going to talk about things that make people uncomfortable, like you can't talk about how Native communities have been treated on college campuses or in the workplace or in rural spaces or urban space. You can't talk about those things and not be uncomfortable. And if you can, then man, I would love to see what your pulse readings look like. So we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right?
Right.
And we have to be comfortable with being challenged. All of us have biases, as you know, and if you're a person that I don't have biases and I treat everybody fairly, then I'm not sure that we're going to move our institutions forward if that's the thinking, right? I don't personally discriminate. If that's the disposition or that's the fallback, then we're not going to be able to move institutions forward, whether we're talking about local government, state governments, institutions, universities, et cetera.
That's a really good point. And when you mention local governments, actually, I think that's a good segue, Dr. Teran, is I'm going to circle to a question that was actually sent to me in my email. It looks like we have a student who, in advance of this session, they actually checked out your bio, and they saw reference to your work with the Interstate 81 project, which you had referenced a couple of moments ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they had noticed that, again, it intersects, it shares a border with the Onondaga people, with the Haudenosaunee. So in your engagement with the Haudenosaunee and your engagement with that project and city officials, how have those items all come together? And in your space as an environmental scholar, according to the student's question, how do you manage all that?
You have to realize that you're dealing with diverse publics. So I shared an experience of talking about environmental justice on the nation. Those conversations and the histories and the experiences and the inequality is going to be radically different than if I have the same conversation with a community on the north side of town that is a new American community. For those of you who have never been, Syracuse has a thriving new American community, folks from all over the globe who have come to this city under any number of circumstances. So their experiences with environmental inequality are going to look radically different than Native experiences, and those issues and experiences are going to be substantively different than, say, a majority Black population that lives on the south side of Syracuse. So you have to recognize that the issues of one community, the south side of town, is going to be very different than the issues of the north side of town. And it's one thing for me to recognize that. Your decision-making processes and networks have to recognize that. So when we think about the work of public policy, when we think about the work of planning, you want to make sure that as many of these players' views are at the table and respected at the table. And when I say that these people are at the table, you can be at the table and be on the menu, right?
Right.
You can be on the table and be consumed. You want to make sure that people have a place at the table and actually have the capacity for meaningful involvement, right? And when I say meaningful involvement, we're not talking about, hey, you got invited to a meeting or you got to listen to a Zoom. We're talking about people who can substantively influence the direction of a project without being connected to the power structure.
Sure. It's a great example. And actually, I think a pretty good connection to the question that we just received from one of our attendees, Alicia, I believe, and thanks for proposing this question. And I'll present it to Dr. Teran. Can you explain?
This is your wheelhouse. I think you should answer this one, Scott.
Well, but also, and I will, as the DEI practitioner, but I'm also curious about your perspective, Dr. Teran, when it comes to to bias, because that does present itself, as you shared in a couple of instances in your work, with local governments and such. What is the difference between explicit and implicit bias? I think it's a great point here from one of our attendees that, again, not everything that is experienced has an intent, but what is the difference? So if you wouldn't mind sharing your definition to that, and then I can provide mine.
Right. So your explicit biases are going to be those that are codified. So I've seen within my professional lifetime, not too long ago, job advertisements that stated one gender was preferred. That's explicit bias. An example of an implicit bias would be these embedded thoughts and embedded patterns that aren't necessarily codified, that allow us to give preference or deference to one group over another.
And Alicia, thank you for that question. It's a really good one. And Dr. Tehran shared a great example for the explicit bias. Implicit, again, often when I facilitate some trainings in this space, I'll reference, for me as a practitioner, I think it's a really good example, and it's a Muhammad Ali video clip. At this point, it's about 40 years old or so. And he talks about, again, some of the messages that we're exposed to that inform the way we see the world. And the one particular video clip, it comes off as tongue-in-cheek, as comedy, but there's a lot of real messages in it. And he talks about, again, we live in a world where the chocolate cake is the black cake and the angel food cake is the white cake. And he sprinkles in all those different examples that, again,
the devil's food cake.
that enforces, again, these messages in our head of how we see the world. And I know this past weekend, there was a lot of sharing in the social media space that I occupy with DEI colleagues about a Procter and Gamble ad that talks about bias. It's called The Look. So for those of you that are watching from afar, if you YouTube that, again, it talks about what are some of those signals that we send that we don't realize, but it does make that individual who receives it feel lesser than. I know there was a conversation a couple of months ago where we talked about, some of those microaggressions, right? Lemire, you had mentioned this a few moments ago about the microaggressions that can come in a variety of different forms. It could be a question in which you ask someone, where are you from? And you respond and you say, hey, I'm from the Lehigh Valley. No, where are you really from? Because it's a message, and it's the way you say it that makes the individual who receives it feel as if I don't belong. And those biases and those microaggressions can present themselves in a variety of different ways. And Lemire, when you're in these spaces with local governments and you're pursuing the work, that's an interesting road to navigate.
Yeah, so interrogating those underlying systems that perpetuate inequality, right? And in order for you to solve a problem, you have to acknowledge a problem is there, do folks have access to the ballot? Well, yeah, I can legally, sign up to register to vote. Is my vote going to lead to some meaningful or substantive change? So we always have to, interrogate and look at systems that undermine if we're hopeful to get to a more equitable society.
Yes, and the bias can manifest itself in so many different ways. I had the honor and privilege to visit a class last week in which the classroom actually has the desks that have a right hand or a left hand oriented setup. And I use that as an example of bias because the vast majority of us identify as right-handed. So when we walk into a classroom space, we're not thinking about, is there a desk for me? And there's an implicit bias when we construct those classrooms. I counted real time in that classroom that there were 3 left-handed desks. So if there are 4 left-handed students,
right,
what's that experience going to be like for them, right? And we don't think about that because, again, that's a bias we have from the privilege of being the dominant right hand, left hand, right? So as we start to unpackage those things, we'll see how they exist. And again, they exist in so many ways. As a 6'3" man, that bias exists in the way we construct things. On occasion, I'll hit my head on some staircases because the world isn't always built for someone who's tall. And I'm not even that tall compared to some other folks. So So thank you again, Alicia, for that question. That
So
was a
I'm
good one.
about to give you a hard time now because we're talking about structural inequality and you're
There we
upset
go.
that you're hitting your head. Now, I'm disappointed in you, Vice President Blair. I'm just giving you a hard time.
No, but that's part of it. So how do we, and again, let's go back to your work with local governments and as especially, you mentioned your time in Syracuse. I know you spent some time in the South, down in Atlanta, I believe. So how do you interrupt those structural biases that exist, especially when you bring in that lens that you have with respect to policy?
Yeah, so you have to have game plans and playbooks that you are willing to actualize. So I'm thinking about some work that we've been doing now for the last year or two in Syracuse related to environmental inequality within the region. So the way our state is constituted, you have different economic development regions. And I was asked to be on a task force related to looking at environmental inequality between urban and rural divides, racial divides, and other divides within the region. So we've been comprising this task force and thinking, well, what are some areas that we can reduce, if not completely eradicate, because the goal is to eradicate these divides. And what are some areas that we should focus on? So lead poisoning in housing is one thing that we've really been focused on.
Right.
Food inequality, people who live in what were formerly known as food deserts or swamps. And now we say, well, these areas are actually functions of food apartheid, right? These are designed social systems. So we've been looking at any number of areas in which you have inequality, and we're creating a template or a game plan to address these inequalities. Now, unfortunately, you had a global pandemic, COVID-19. Much of the work of that committee was put on hold, so we were still working, but we started looking at these problems through a COVID-19 centric lens. Don't think that lead poisoning for young children is going to cease just because COVID-19 is happening. If anything, it may be going up because we're spending more time indoors. So you're talking about more points of exposure. But developing game plans, roadmaps, and playbooks for communities to abide by. And the second part about that, it's one thing to have unenforceable playbooks. It's one thing to say, well, this is what I think we should do this is what we think you should do to get food justice. But, there has to be consequences when we don't abide by smart practices. There has to be consequences when we don't remediate lead poisoned or lead laden housing. Has to be consequences. So we like to focus on we like to be optimistic and think about our game plans, but it has to be a society that says, wait a minute, no more. If you've punished so many people, hundreds of thousands of millions of people for being engaged in non-violent so-called crimes, if we're not willing to punish folks for the status quo in relation to lead poisoning, if you think that food is a right and we have a society that produces a lack of food access, then we're going to have to totally reimagine what justice and equality is in this society.
As you introduce those items, Lemire, in my head, I think about the term redlining. I wonder if you could explore that a little bit with some of our attendees today, and some of the questions and answers that come when we start to explore the term redlining.
Yeah, so if you were to type in redlining on a web search, you can see the work of an organization called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. And essentially what HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, is, they created templates to develop to understand the borrowing practices for homeowners pretty much in every neighborhood in the country. Like if you were a city, a suburban area, HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, they came to your neighborhood and said, okay, these are neighborhoods worthy of investment. So that is the difference between I can get money to finance a house or I can't get money from a bank to finance a house. And if you think about the racial implications, what neighborhoods got redlined? Well, we can look right here in Syracuse, or we can look in your community. We could go south to Philly, or we could go over to Pittsburgh. You can see the disproportionate number of neighborhoods that weren't worthy of investment, at least according to this organization. These were Black neighborhoods, these were Asian neighborhoods, these were Latino neighborhoods, Latina neighborhoods. And that's not just something that happened in the 1930s and early 40s that didn't have long-term repercussions. When you think about the amount of wealth generation in the 20th century from private home ownership, you would know this is basically a form of theft, right? not giving people access to the GI Bill, not giving people access to home ownership, not giving people access to college campuses, not giving people access to work at a factory. This is long-term systemic theft that has generational consequences. And it wasn't just the work of Hulk alone. They operated in concert with your Realtors Association. You know, if you go back to and look at a realty code from the late 1920s and 30s, and, you know, I'm trying to think about what point I want to give you the specific number statute within this realty code, but it essentially says the job of the realtor is to make sure that you don't introduce races into a community that could cause or lead to upheaval or instability, you know, blatantly racist practice. So you have to know your history. And if you know that history, then you'll understand that these are not things that died in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s. These are things that left a generational legacy. If I don't have a house to pass down to my children, well, that's theft of wealth. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a great, for our attendees on this Zoom, on this workshop this afternoon, take a moment and also explore a really great documentary that came out a few years ago from PBS. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion, and did a great job of highlighting some of the concepts that Dr. Turan just shared with respect to redlining and the ramifications of that prevention, that prevention of access, and in this case, home ownership, in the American dream. It was not available to everyone. And I know there's also a yellow lining there. We do want to acknowledge that too, that there were communities from Europe that were yellow lined. They didn't receive 100% access to those home loans during that time. But a really, really telling experience that, and those are the seeds that were planted that we are now experiencing in America right now, right, Lemire, in 2020 here in October.
Yeah, you'll look at these documents and you'll look at these government or quasi-government documents, and, you know, the yellow lining, the red coded neighborhoods, blue or green, just based on the credit worthiness that was attributed to a certain community. But you'll see words used like infiltration, like these races are infiltrating the community. And like I said, just the legacy of inequality has really stained. And that's something that, you know, we think about the lasting effects of physical infrastructure. So you build a bridge on top of a community, that might be a decision that has a 70 or 80 year consequence. I was explaining to my students today when we went on that walking tour, your social infrastructure, your economic infrastructure, that also can lead to decision-making that has a 70 or 80 year consequence, in some cases even more.
And now you're starting to introduce a little bit, you know, of the web that is spun, right? The connection of some of those systems, right? So when we look at housing inequality, how that connects to food insecurity, how that connects to health disparities, how that connects to educational disparities, right? That web is very strong. So when we engage in one, very quickly do we start also seeing connections to others. So with that, you know, we're going to kind of bounce out to this macro level 30,000 foot view, right? We really started to drill down on some of those core concepts. So when you bop out and you engage with communities, with local governments, and even with students, because it's very easy to get lost in some of those concepts. How do we ensure that we inform ourselves while also keeping our eyes looking forward when it comes to equity action?
Right. Well, in the same way that when you're looking forward, you're thinking about remediative strategies to eradicate that brownfield next door. You're thinking about a remediative strategy to undo a development project that assigned an inordinate amount of risk to community X, Y, or Z. I think that we need to interrogate and examine our social policy in the same way. So when we think about the legacy of marginalization to the workplace or to educational facilities, access to education, in the same way that you remediate a tract of land across the street from you, you would take out those heavy metals if you thought that they were going to get in your garden, your collard greens, or you knew your kids were going to play in it and you didn't want them to play at a playground that had heavy metals. I think that you need to examine your social, academic, and educational infrastructure the same way. If you have a history of toxicity, you have to be willing to address those things and remediation, make right, which was subject to prior harm.
Right. And with this, I also want to encourage, and we're getting close to the hour, encourage attendees, if you have any questions, please don't be shy to place something in the chat. But that brownfield conversation, right? When we start looking at some of the harm that was done in our communities, and looking to remedy that, there's so much there. And I think being able to connect this back to the experience of our Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, that's where some of these things come together. I know we spent some time talking about the brownfields in Syracuse and their locations to some of the very pivotal ancestral grounds of the Haudenosaunee. I know that's come up when it came to the Dakota pipeline a few years ago, and their location with some very important Indigenous lands out in the Dakotas. So again, the intersections of these items are very profound. So the attention to them, as your scholarship has led you to, are some really important conversations to be had.
Yeah, so you can think about some great scholarship that's been produced that talks about the disproportionate dependence that many, not all, but many Native communities have on natural resources. So when you disrupt natural resource systems, they may affect non-Native communities a lot less profoundly. And I'm very careful with the language just because we want to guard against generalizations to our audience. So I just want to be very careful with that language. I don't want anybody to say, well, you're saying that all Native communities have close proximity to natural resources. Very important for me to articulate that.
Correct.
If you just think about the disproportionate consequences and proximity that many Native communities will be affected by when natural resource systems are affected, whether you're talking about food systems, whether you're talking about spiritual systems, economic systems, this can be due to the disruption of a local lake, the disruption of salmon, we can go down the list. The disruption of local forests can be very damaging to Native communities in ways that people and communities who are not embedded in these natural systems don't necessarily see and or experience directly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where, again, I think that's a pretty good place for us to come back to, which is, again, the spirit of our discussion this afternoon, is for us to get to a place of action. We have to first understand what are the causes, what are the challenges, what are the experiences. And once we are immersing ourselves in those experiences and providing space, again, we talk about the term agency, right? For our communities to be able to speak to their experience and be a part of the solutions, then we can start thinking about action. So your presentation of these items, Dr. Teran, are really important because it helps us move through that spectrum and getting ourselves to that place again of action. And those opportunities for action, as you've stated throughout the time together here this last hour, looks different depending on our community. So it's important that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. But when we have that mindfulness, that's the competency piece that's so important, that will allow us to really have an inclusive lens to the work.
No doubt, no doubt.
So we have another question, and Naomi, thank you so much for presenting this. Dr. Teran, if I could present this to you. She asks, for students on campus who may experience microaggressions, how do you suggest they respond to them, or even if they should respond to all? What's some advice that could bring them peace of mind when this happens on a college campus? Thank you, Naomi, for the question.
Yeah, so that's a really difficult question to answer because I always want to be delicate. So be willing to advocate for yourself. But then when I say be willing to advocate for yourself, that makes you, the person, not you specifically, Naomi, but that puts you in an awkward position of having to do things that you shouldn't have to do. Like, you should be respected, and you shouldn't, your job as a student or staff or faculty member isn't to fight back against racism. So I'm always delicate when answering these questions. So number one, recognize what the infrastructure is to deal with processes and complaints of discrimination, whether they be sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, ability-based biased on and on and on. Be aware what those channels are, and just think about how crazy this time is, right? Where to go to school to do your job, you have to have in the back of your mind, hey, if person X, Y, or Z says or does this, I need to know what the infrastructure is to deal with these problems. So it's not an easy question for me to answer. One thing I would say is you have to respond in a way that's going to enable you to sleep at night, right? So a lot of times that, somebody may say something to us, and if we don't respond, we'll go home and we'll sleep. And when you wake up the next morning, you'll still be thinking about it. You'll still be bothered. And just think about the anxiety and the pressure that creates on marginalized communities when you're thinking. So a lot of times, if you address things right then and there, confrontation, conflict is okay. You might sleep a little bit better and that person may get educated, but I never want you to think that your job is to educate the racist. There are people whose job is to do that. Your job is to get a degree or to, do whatever it is that your responsibility at the university is. So it's a very difficult question for me to answer. I won't expect, or I won't present that I'm the guru. I can tell you how I would handle something, but at the end of the day, you have to do what makes sense to you, but know what the mechanisms on campus or in the community are to address bias incidents. That would probably be the first thing to do.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And again, thank you for the question. And I think one of the ways, again, is what's really, really important is to have that support. So whether it's another student, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a faculty member or a staff member on campus, to be able to even process the experience, because that sometimes will help. And that can go a long way. So I even offer that, again, for our colleagues that are here in whatever way that I can help as a member of the DeSales University community. That goes a long way. And those microaggressions, they can look and they can have a form that varying, right? Varying. And whether it's as a person of color, whether it's as a woman in a underrepresented field such as STEM, whether it's a student athlete, all those different identities, the microaggressions that could be presented, being able to have someone to connect with, to kind of process and act as appropriate is really important. So Dr. Teran, thank you for sharing that. And again, honoring the fact that, again, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to answering that question, but it's an important one. We're glad that it's asked. When we look down here, Lemire, at some of the questions, and again, I had mentioned one earlier that was in my email directed by a student who wasn't able to join us today. Again, I'm gonna go back to kind of those comments we made a few moments ago, that there's so much that we processed today, right? We spoke a little bit about Indigenous peoples, and today, as October 12th, Indigenous Peoples Day, and the intersection of that new concept and intersecting with the tradition of Columbus Day. There are a lot of questions, and I think we answered that. I'm providing this in summary for those folks who maybe jumped on the call a couple of moments late. When we talk about this work, when we talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, again, we're doing so in a way to acknowledge the contributions that all of our communities have had on these great lands. And that, in a lot of ways, is the spirit of Indigenous Peoples Day. And when we start to examine that, we see there are inequities in the experience, and that looks and feels so different depending on the environment. And I think Dr. Teran gave us some really meaningful ways to kind of interrupt that, and knowing that it can take place in our engagement with communities, with local governments or community organizations, or with students and colleagues on a college campus. What's most important is, again, to get this competency level to understand that let's provide pathways for our rich, diverse communities to have a voice in this experience. And instead of speaking for, provide an opportunity for them to speak on their own behalves. And I think that's the true spirit of inclusion, Lemire. So I think as we look to adjourn this workshop, do you have any closing thoughts, especially as we look to kind of summarize the rich conversation and items that you presented for us to consider this afternoon?
Yeah, so you mentioned cultural competency right there, something we didn't touch on today. So critical. So part 2 or round 2, whenever you do another one of these, that might be a good jumping off point. But I would say closing thoughts, something I've been thinking about within my own vocation. What's this field going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? What is environmental science, forestry, urban policy going to look like in 20, 30 years? And I've been spending time thinking about how do I shift what I'm doing with my research agenda? How do I shift what I'm doing in my engagement with my classroom? How do I shift what I'm doing in my interaction with public officials and people in communities? So it's a spirit and willingness to learn and to grow. So with this, what's the next step in DEI, right? So we know about mandatory trainings and we know about protocol for addressing issues. I would invite you and others to think, okay, this is the current template. What does it look like in 5 or 10 years? And how can we move this thing forward for more meaningful results? So that doesn't mean the processes that are happening now, cultural competence trainings and sexual harassment workshops. It doesn't mean that these things aren't meaningful, but I would say we need to spend some time thinking about how can we move this field, scholarship, how can we move our universities forward? And if we're not thinking about 20 or 30 or 40 or whatever number of years into the future, we're not thinking about regenerative processes.
I think that's a great place for us to finish. And there's the challenge. And as we diversify our communities, whether it's our communities of color, students, employees, underrepresented populations on campus, those are the questions of how are we matching our actions to be able to support the diverse perspectives that we have in our communities, and being able to look forward. And when you challenge us, Dr. Tran, to look forward, we are introduced to concepts such as a growing underrepresented student population within the next 10 years. The country that we know and love so much will be even more diverse 10 years from now than it is now. So what does that look like for us as institutions of higher learning, of higher education, when it comes to serving the needs of our students and also serving the needs of our colleagues on campus? So you gave us so much to consider today, and again, to be able to pay respect and to honor our Indigenous peoples on this Indigenous Peoples Day, and the work that you do as an environmental scholar, as an environmental justice scholar, and the opportunities you've had to connect this work with our communities, one that I know I am appreciative of your time this afternoon. So I'm glad you were able to introduce some of these concepts for us to consider, things such as redlining and the such. So as we continue to advance, not just on our own respective campuses, but within our communities, these are lessons that we have to continue to move forward. So with that, we are just about at time. So if there are no other questions, we want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Dr. Tran, thank you for your time this afternoon and to be able to join the DeSales University community today. Everyone enjoy the afternoon. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, sir. Take care of yourself.
Be well.